Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Lavinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm so thrilled today to welcome Tana Wojczuk for the launch of her new book, The Lady Romeo, The Radical and Revolutionary Life of Charlotte Cushman, America's First Celebrity, in conversation with Amy Brady. We're especially happy to be celebrating one of Windsor Terrace locals of ours by way of Boulder, and be able to reach all of you in the comforts of your homes. And luckily for us, tonight we have an aptly named drink pairing for the night, the Lady Romeo, which I shared earlier on our Twitter account if you want to check that out. So cheers and happy pub day to Tana. So to housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click the Q&A button just here at the bottom of your screen where you can submit a question. We'll try to get through as many of those as we can at the end of the event. There's also the chat here below where I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, as well as a link to donate to organizations fighting racism and police brutality, if that is within your means. A caveat for tonight's event and for all virtual events, we are all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please do bear with any technical issues that could arise during the program. We will try to solve those quickly. And finally, we'll be adding more virtual programming through the summer and into the fall, because this is just not going to end. So please do check in on our event listings and sign up for our newsletter to find out more. One that I'm going to mention, happening this Thursday, we're hosting Andrew Martin for the launch of his new story collection, Cool for America, in conversation with Hallie Butler. So you can head over to our website to register for that and others. So now a little about tonight's participants, and we'll get started. Tana Wojczuk is a senior nonfiction editor at Guernica and teaches writing at New York University. Previously, she has worked as an arts critic for Vice, Bomb Magazine, and Paste, and as a columnist for Guernica. Her other essays, criticisms, and poetry have appeared in the New York Times, Tin House, The Believer, and elsewhere. She has an MFA in nonfiction from Columbia University, where she formerly taught, and was recently a finalist for the Gulf Coast Nonfiction Prize, and has been a fellow at the Helen Wurlitzer Foundation Residency and the Tin House Summer Writers Workshop. And Amy Brady is the editor-in-chief of the Chicago Review of Books, the deputy publisher of Guernica magazine, and the co-editor of House on Fire, an anthology of personal essays about climate change forthcoming from Catapult. Her writing has appeared in O, the Oprah magazine, the New Republic, Slate, and other places. She's won awards from the National Science Foundation, the Bread Loaf Environmental Writers Conference, and is a recipient of an Andrew W. Mellon Research Fellowship from the Library of Congress. So Tana and Amy, the stage is yours.
Great. Thanks, Hal. Hi, Tana.
Hi, Amy.
Congratulations. This is so exciting to see your book finally out in the world.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. I wanted to just say quickly thank you to Community Bookstore and Terrace Books, their offshoot bookstore in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. Spent so many hours there and looking forward to doing it again soon. And thanks, Amy. Really.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight to celebrate the launch of this amazing new book. Tana's book biography, Lady Romeo, The Radical and Revolutionary Life of Charlotte Cushman, America's First Celebrity, is hands down one of the best biographies I've read in forever. And not just because it's so beautifully written, but because it's a really important story. You rescued a radical, talented life from the dustbins of history and told it in this tantalizing, dramatized way. And I can't wait for other people to read it as well. For those of you who have yet to pick up the book, once you do, you'll find that it tells the story of Charlotte Cushman, beginning as a young child when she gets the bug for the theater, follows her through her career as an actress, and eventually does become America's first bona fide celebrity, capturing the hearts of thousands and thousands and thousands, including the great Walt Whitman, which was a wonderful revelation for me when I was reading this book. I guess let me just start out by just talking about the structure for this evening. Tana, I believe you'll begin by reading a short selection from your book, and then she and I will talk a bit about the book and whatever else Tana would like to talk about. And then there will be time at the end of the event tonight to take some questions for the audience. So if y'all have questions, please put them in the little Q&A box kind of at the bottom of your screen there, and we'll take as many as we have time for. So with that, Tana, do you want to go ahead and read from Lady Romeo?
Yes, great. So thank you for that introduction. It's great to hear Cushman's name on anybody's lips. It's just so exciting for me after many years of being like, well, here's who she was. It's very cool. So the excerpt that I'm reading today is going to be from partway through the book. It's from chapter 7. And I chose this in part because it was really important to me in researching this book to try to discover what made Charlotte so good, and what did people actually see in her. It's this part of theater history that's really hard to capture, and it's sort of this was one of the moments where I got a good clear sense of how she made characters really unique and really her own, and also sort of engaged in this sort of subtle, rebellious social criticism. So we'll see. Okay, so as the chapter opens, a little context. So Cushman she's from Boston. She's moved to New York. She's trying to make it in New York. And she's struggled for several years to get hired by this prestigious Park Theater, which is the best theater in New York. She's finally hired as a walking lady, which means she takes whatever part they give her and she works every night, and she's proven that she can play big roles like Lady Romeo, Lady Macbeth, but they won't give her these main roles. And so that's kind of what's going on here. She's supporting her family. She's brought them over to New York. She's supporting everyone. And so her success is really important for her whole family's survival at this point. Okay, and so Susan here, who starts it off, is her sister. When Susan opened the paper, she gasped. She called their mother, Mary Eliza, over and pointed to the announcement. Charlotte will be furious, she said. It was February 1839. Frost made paisley patterns on the window panes, and outside horses struggled to pull cabs down the street in deep snow. Charlotte had not gone to the theater that day, staying home in front of the fire with Susan, Mary Eliza, and Susan's baby, Ned. But the news Susan brought was chilling. It was a cast list for the Park's next production, Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, with Charlotte in the role of the prostitute Nancy. It was not a starring role. Charlotte's friend, Annie Brewster, recalled it as, quote, always given to actresses of little or no position in the company. It was also dangerous, since actresses already had to fight against the stereotype that they were essentially prostitutes themselves. Charlotte was furious, but she couldn't do anything about it. Her contract said she had to take any part. She suspected Stephen Price, one of the managers, disliked her. I was at the mercy of the man, she later recalled. It was midwinter, my bread had to be earned, I dared not refuse or even remonstrate, for I knew he wished to provoke me to break my engagement. By casting her as a prostitute, Price was being reckless with her reputation. Playing a prostitute put her in the line of fire for moralizing journalists like Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Herald Tribune. Greeley wrote in one review that a large proportion of those connected with the stage are libertines and courtesans. In their New York apartment, Susan tried to hush Ned's crying, Mary Eliza mended costumes, and Charlotte sat in a chair, reading and rereading Dickens' novel. It was clear she could not simply button herself into the role of Nancy. It was as it was already made. She would have to take a seam ripper to the thing and piece it out herself. She was determined to get the better of her enemy. What he designed for my mortification should be my triumph, she wrote. Up to the night appointed for Oliver Twist, she was not seen by anyone. She took her meals in her room and spent her time out of the house on clandestine rambles. She was rehearsing in secret, studying, as she said, the bare skeleton of the part, clothing it with flesh, giving it life and interest, to get a sense of Nancy as a human being. To get a sense of what a prostitute like Nancy would have to endure, Charlotte even ventured into 5 points. So in the book, I have a little bit of the history of 5 points, which was once very beautiful and then became completely polluted by slaughterhouses. There was a big collect pond there. So I'm going to skip over that and get into 5 points itself. When Charles Dickens visited the neighborhood on his American tour, he found it at least as bad as the London slums he fictionalized in Oliver Twist. Quote, narrow ways diverging to the left and right, reeking everywhere with dirt and filth. Seeing pigs in the streets, Dickens asked, do they ever wonder why their masters walk upright in lieu of going on all fours? The aristocrats of 5 Points, it was said, were the butchers because their children never went hungry. Middle-class tourists might pay to go slumming in 5 Points with a police escort holding camphor-soaked handkerchiefs to their noses to see how the poor really lived. A woman did not wander off there alone without telling anyone where she was going. Walking alone among the smell of roasted corn and the cries of the hot corn girls, Charlotte heard music spilling out onto the street from nearly every bar and public house, and a new kind of percussive dancing born in 5 Points called tap. When she got thirsty, she could buy a lemonade or a shandy from a German street vendor. Passing a dilapidated building called the Old Brewery that housed more than 1,000 people, Charlotte walked the same streets that Whitman frequented. While even well-meaning social reformers tended to think of violence and crime as the special talent of the poor, Whitman saw 5 Points as a wellspring of what he called the Republic's most needed asset, the wealth of stout poor men who will work. Immigrants did their best to make tenement apartments into homes, decorating their mantels with pictures and keepsakes of the life they'd left behind. Although Charlotte's family had come to America on the Mayflower, she was driven by the same dream as these new immigrants. She was empathetic toward the prostitutes she met, and she watched them carefully to find the spark of recognition that would help her bring Nancy to life. She had no trouble finding prostitutes since once, as one observer wrote, every house was a brothel and every brothel a hell. So she goes into 5 Points and she trades her clothes with that of a dying prostitute. And those clothes become her costume for Nancy. So when the show opens, nobody sees her. She goes directly from her dressing room to the stage. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the Park Theater. So at the top are the poorest of the poor, and they can throw things at the stage when they don't like it. And the third tier are actual prostitutes servicing clients. And the next tier down are the box seats and the wealthy people. And then a whole bunch of sort of ticket holders, and then the pit where the penny ticket holders sit. Toward the end of the play, Nancy betrays her lover by freeing Oliver from captivity. He orders Sykes to, when the crime boss discovers what she's done, he orders Sykes to kill her. In her final scene, Nancy is in bed. Hearing a noise, she sits up suddenly. She's not alone. A shape in the doorway moves toward her, but with relief, she realizes it's only Sykes. She reaches for him, but he pushes her away and blows the candle out, demanding she get up. She pushes herself off the bed. Is that you? Oh, I'm so glad. There's light enough for what I've got to do, Sykes says and strikes her in the face. In other productions, Sykes dragged Nancy away to murder her off stage, but Charlotte had a better idea. She choreographed a fearful struggle between Nancy and Sykes, which her height and strength made into a real contest. She gave the audience a chance to believe Nancy might actually get away. This was true in the novel, which described the murder in gruesome detail. The murder of Nancy was a great scene, enthused one critic. Charlotte instructed the actor playing Sykes to drag her around the stage by her hair, looking defiantly at the gallery. The audience hissed him, cursing like a Handel festival chorus. Sykes dragged Nancy around the stage twice more. He shook his fist at the audience like Ajax defying the lightning. The crowd's roars grew louder and more blasphemous, the noise and excitement rising to a climax Charlotte had carefully orchestrated. Sykes, working up to this well-rehearsed climax, smeared Nancy with red ochre and taking her by the hair, and this is a quote, a most powerful wig, seemed to dash her brains out on the stage. No explosion of dynamite invented by the modern anarchist, this is a quote, no language ever dreamt of in Bedlam could equal the outburst. Whitman was one of the many watching Charlotte's performance that night in the hopes that she would finally prove Americans could produce more than pale imitations of European art. When he saw her Nancy, he found her delightfully appalling. writing in a column for the Brooklyn Eagle, it was the most intense acting ever felt on the park boards. He believed that no one who watched her could help but marvel at the towering grandeur of her genius. Her managers didn't agree, and when her contract expired after 3 years and she asked for a raise, they turned her down and she quit, and then she went to London. So this is sort of a cliffhanger. All right, I think that's good for now. Thanks.
Yay! Oh, that's one of my favorite chapters in the whole book, Tana. I mean, and not just because it shows, shed some light on Cushman's approach to acting, but it also just shows so beautifully, I think, what the theater was like in early 19th century America and the role of actresses back then, which I think it's safe to say they had a rather different social role, or at least perceived to as having a different social role then than they do now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, Nancy was not the great role that it is today. I actually played Nancy in the musical Twist when I was a teenager. And it was not the same. But yeah, I mean, actresses were really considered, little better than prostitutes. I mean, many of them were actually former prostitutes who were brought into the theater by the theater managers who were their lovers. But acting in America, unless you were an opera singer, was still really lowbrow. It didn't matter if you were doing Shakespeare or Dickens in this case. And women working in general were a suspect class. And as one of the few jobs open to women, people were very suspicious of the fact that these females were going out on stage and displaying themselves for money.
Mm-hmm. And so in a lot of ways, Charlotte challenged that perception as not only what an actress can be and can do, but also of the American theater, right? Because at this time in history, isn't it safe to say that American theater was not thought of in the same regard as, say, British theater?
Yeah. So anything that came from Europe was considered automatically good. And in the same review that I quoted, Whitman complained that people would rather celebrate fifth-rate, as he said, fifth-rate artistic trash from Europe than an American artist, no matter how good they were. And this really got in the way of America creating its own culture because Americans themselves believed this. And they didn't have a sense of what their unique culture was going to be or going to look like. And Cushman was not only a powerhouse, tragic actress, but she actually created these moments of real deep feeling and transcendence in the theater and went beyond melodrama, which is what people were used to seeing. Just very over the top, sort of, they called it acting for points. And she created, really special moments in the theater for people, and they were deeply moved. And so that helped define American theater as something that could be what they called like more of a force of nature. And it connected with the movement of the Romantics who wanted to go back to nature and find power there in this sort of raw, less cultured in a way, beauty. And she really evoked that for a lot of people on the stage. Yeah.
That's amazing. And instead of going into the theater, into the nature, she went into the heart of 5 Points.
She did.
To try to draw inspiration.
No nature left.
For her character. Which I also love from that chapter, because we also start to see a hint of her approach to the craft. Could you also talk a little bit about why that in and of itself was radical and revolutionary?
Yeah. So actors tended to play archetypes. And, Dickens' play was new, so it was a good opportunity to sort of create something fresh. But typically, a prostitute was a slattern or was a very sexy slattern, maybe. And Lady Macbeth was also like this seductress. And there were these broad types that actors kind of were expected to slot themselves into, and were typecast essentially on their ability to fulfill those roles. And Cushman didn't fit into any of those roles. She had a very unique look. She definitely didn't play any of the ingenues. And she really challenged people's notions of what these characters should be. And her Lady Macbeth was very powerful and physically intimidating. And she approached things in the way that we would now call more of a method actor, in the sense that she actually did deep research to try to find out about these characters. I recently talked to the author Isaac Butler, who has a book coming out about the method. And we were talking about the fact that you really think about the method as like, oh, I've experienced this, and so my character experienced this. And even one of her co-stars said, oh, I fell off a ship and was almost eaten by sharks, so I can play tragic figures. But no, actually the origins of method acting were deep research. And she read and reread these plays, and people said again and again what an intellectual actor she was also. And she really, from her letters, you can see how deeply she is thinking about these roles in the language of Shakespeare, for example, and what they mean. So that's another way that she really changed the interpretation. And when she went to London, she really respected the text of Shakespeare, and they were not performing the original text of Shakespeare. They were performing a version that was, Romeo and Juliet woke up at the end and were in love, and it was a happy ending. This funny version for many years. And so she insisted that they reinstate the full text of Shakespeare, and cared a lot about what the text had to say.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about her roles in Shakespeare, because as your title suggests, she played some of the most well-known and beloved masculine roles in Shakespeare, including Hamlet and, of course, Romeo. I absolutely loved your description of her production of Romeo in London for the first time. Can you talk a bit about why that performance was so unusual?
Yeah, so it was a big risk to play a man's role in London as a newcomer and an American. The deck was already stacked against her, and not a beautiful actress, quote unquote, what people thought. And her manager initially thought she was too ugly to be hired and wouldn't hire her. And she convinced him. She was very convincing. When she went to play Romeo, she did not play it as a sort of, hey, look, it's a woman in tights kind of sideshow or titillation. She played it in a very realistic way. Even though physically she was very buxom, she didn't bind her breasts, audiences were very taken in by her as a man, and saw her as the kind of man that they really admired, actually. Not what they would call their own, modern man, but more of almost a throwback to the 17th century. Sword fighting and courageous, but also very passionate and very loving in ways that men at the time were really not allowed to be in public. And she very smartly cast her sister as Juliet and brought her sister over. And this did a couple of things. One, it was great for publicity. Like, wow, the Cushman sisters and Romeo and Juliet. But also, when she made love to her sister on stage and cradled her body and wept over it at the end of the performance, it was both real and acceptable, because it wasn't a woman loving another woman on stage. It was her sister. So of course it couldn't be real. And, of course, what people, in London didn't know about Cushman was she was absolutely loved other women and had female partners. But this was an acceptable way for them to see this kind of love on stage.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely incredible. And while reading it, I was just trying to imagine today how, publicists would handle the idea of a sister and sister, or even a brother and sister playing Romeo and Juliet on stage. It's an incredible chapter. But let's talk a little bit about Cushman's personal life, which you just broached, because it is also an important part of your book that I think is very interesting and sheds light into her as a thinker and a more larger than life person. She was a queer woman, though they wouldn't have used the word queer, in the early 19th century. How did she navigate those romantic relationships, as a queer woman, but also as a working woman? She had a professional, career that took her across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, those are two great questions, or part of that question. She, there's a lot of debate among scholars about how visible queerness was at the time, because it wasn't in the language, as you said, but certainly when you read private letters, you see that people are talking about it all the time. And it was certainly visible. It was just not written about publicly. So Sharon Marcus wrote a great book called Between Women, which I recommend, that talks a lot about this. But for example, when Elizabeth Barrett Browning met Cushman, she wrote to her sister, oh, like Cushman and Max, Matilda Hayes, who was her partner at the time, they go everywhere together and they dress alike. It seems like a female marriage. And her sister wrote back like, yeah, it's pretty common. Like, with it, basically. I'm paraphrasing. So, this is the question of like how she navigated it publicly was in a way like less of a question than it might be now, because writers weren't writing about it explicitly, so she didn't have the opportunity in a way to talk about this, publicly. Certainly it came through in very sexist critics and criticism of her and her masculinity and her ugliness, so to speak, which many women, by the way, did not find her ugly at all. So it's a totally subjective term. And then, when she became really successful, she moved with her partner Matilda Hayes to Rome and created an artist colony with other female artists in Rome. Max was the translator of George Sand. Grace Greenwood, who came with her, that was her pen name. She was the first woman journalist at the New York Times. Harriet Hosmer, incredibly talented sculptor who went around dressed as a boy all the time anyway. Incredible group of female artists, and they had a lot of love triangles, and sort of this was her opportunity to create her own community of women and of lovers, to be honest. I mean, she had many different lovers, and even though she usually had one woman who she was committed to and partnered with, she also had many love affairs as well. And her fame and her wealth contributed to her ability to do that.
I was going to say, it sounds a little bit like the American celebrities of today.
Yeah, she, it's funny because she really thought marriage was sacred, and also thought most people should not get married. Most women should not get married. And I think she saw herself as operating in a different social structure that she was experimenting with. And as she was doing this in Rome, Bronson Alcott had founded Fruitlands in America, and Louisa May Alcott was growing up on this commune where people had, it was really, the goal wasn't to have multiple partners, but they did have multiple partners. So there were a lot of people sort of experimenting with these different structures at the time too.
Well, I think we have time for at least one more question before I turn it to the audience. So folks joining us tonight, just a reminder, if you do have any questions for Tana tonight, please put them down in the Q&A icon, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we have time for. So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that she was America's first celebrity. Your book opens kind of at the end of her career, with her saying goodbye to the stage, and as she's leaving the theater, she's followed by throngs of fans, which sounds incredibly exciting and also exhausting. So, as someone who spends just so much time, kind of studying her life in this time period, if you could kind of narrow it to like a nugget or a quality, what was it, either about Charlotte that made her a celebrity, that made people love her so much? Or was it even about her? Was there also just something kind of in the culture or in the air, the way that, my parents were ready for the Beatles.
Yeah.
Was there something about, that time period where people were just ready to finally have a celebrity?
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's all of those things. It's like what did audiences see in her, right? Which I think we touched on. So, I mean, there's more to say, but I'm going to talk about these other two facets, which is what was it in her that made her, able to do this, and then also the timing, sort of confluence of events. So what it was in her is really interesting. It was cool to read some of the Lytton Strachey biography and the sort of birth of psychological biography, basically, because Cushman is a great subject for that. She loved to study people, and a lot of her psychological realism that she brought to the stage came from her just being fascinated by people's mannerisms. She got in trouble as a kid for copying her priest while he was there having tea. But she really took note of what made people appear to be one way or the other, and looking at character as a performance. She really did. She also came from this really interesting combination of Puritan American, work ethic, which is like, you don't matter, what you do matters, and work is godly. That's how you do God, right? And there's also the Transcendentalist movement at the time. I think she was raised Unitarian, but I would say she had a lot more in common with the Transcendentalists like Emerson, who was her pastor, because she believed in her own path towards God, that she could decide what felt godly. And that was, for her, that was work and family and taking care of her family. And she really believed that her talent was God-given and it was her duty. She didn't think it was selfish to be ambitious. She actually reframed it in a really interesting way that's now very American, but was not common at the time, which is that it's my duty to fulfill my destiny, and my talent is a sign that this is what I should be doing. A lot of those romantic poems she thought were about her, basically. And also, she worked through 10 years of having breast cancer and multiple painful operations, and she would go on stage and be leaning on something because she couldn't stand, or she would give her performance from a chair. She worked constantly, partly to provide for her family and partly because she felt driven. So there's all these different sides to her. And then the confluence of events was, Americans, she was born just a couple weeks after the 40-year anniversary of America's founding, and she died on the centenary that year. So in that period of time, America was really hungry. They had a certain amount, I should say, I'm going to geek out. After the War of 1812, when the British tried again to take America back, America had a certain degree of economic independence and was ready to think about theater and culture and who are we and what do we want to be. So there's that as well. I mean, the Civil War changed and broke a lot of those ideas down again, but certainly from the 30s through the 60s, that was what was going on.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I could keep talking to you about this all night, but we have a lot of questions that are starting to come in, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get to some of them. It looks like a lot of people are interested, and I am as well, in how you first discovered Charlotte Cushman.
Yeah.
Where did you first hear about her, and how did you know that there was a story to tell?
Yeah, I was sort of predisposed to love Cushman's story, or to love her, as someone who grew up in love with Shakespeare, but feeling like Shakespeare was high culture and sort of not mine. Not growing up wealthy or sort of going to the opera or anything like that. I had this very high culture, low culture debate going on in my head. But then when I went to theater festival, Shakespeare festivals as a kid, when my parents took me to them, I realized that, wait a minute, there's like sex jokes in here. Like, hold on a second. And it really started to dawn on me that this was something that was for me. And so when I saw Cushman, what I realized was, wait a minute, there's a big part of the story that I don't understand, or that I never knew, which was she helped create that version of American Shakespeare that meant so much to me when I was a kid. And also, I think like many people growing up female in a world full of men's stories, especially adventure stories, there was also a big tension and disconnect. And I thought, like, do I have, how do I position myself? I want to have adventures. I don't want to be the person in the castle. And so, Cushman's story also struck me as an adventure story. And so that made me really excited. Like, she's out there having this amazing adventure. So there's a combination of things in me that primed me to want to write about her. And then, just learning about her playing Romeo and playing Hamlet and what people saw in her that really got me going.
Great. Well, it looks like we have a lot of people here who share a trait with you and me, Tana. We have a lot of research nerds. And yes, I know, I love to see it. And we have a lot of questions asking if there were any particular archives that you visited that were especially rich, or if there were any letters, for example, that you may have read that shed some light on her life and her story.
Yeah, definitely. So partly because of the way that the 19th century ignored queerness in public, I tried not to rely on a lot of published material at the time, but really on private letters. So the Library of Congress has the largest collection of Cushman's letters, which were saved by Emma Crow Cushman, who was a 19-year-old actress Cushman had an affair with, and then married off to her nephew, who was also her adopted son. Very soap opera. But this woman loved Cushman and refused to burn the letters. And Cushman would write over and over again, please burn this letter. And she didn't, thankfully. So there are many of those. They are kind of from the end of her life. So they're more about like her domestic life and her private life, not as much from the prime of her career, but still really great. And sometimes she writes about her earlier time. But I would also say, like, looking at card catalogs in the New York Library for Performing Arts, like not just the digitized material, but actually what's in their existing card catalogs is really cool. They have a lot of reviews that have not seen the light of day. The Houghton Theater Library has some letters, really important letters to, from, and about Cushman, like from Longfellow, for example. The Morgan Library has some letters between Charles Dickens and this famous actor Macready that mention Cushman. And there are numerous other archives who also like made their material available. Like the National Library of Scotland sent me some of their material. So if you can't travel, there's still ways. There's still ways to do it. And many of the research nerds will already know this, but most of the like really excellent material came from looking at miscellaneous folders and card catalogs, and asking librarians, because every collection is created by people and they don't all work the same. So talking to librarians was the best, because they were like, here's how this collection works, here's how to find stuff, and here's how to find stuff that's not indexed yet, because if a person is forgotten or not popular, they are not always going to be indexed. And so it really helps to just, ask for the background, ask for the goods.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I love these two questions together. What did you learn about Charlotte during your research that you were most surprised by? And are there any memorials or places today that recognize her?
So I can't, as a very anxious person myself, I kept expecting to find like I'm so famous, but I really don't deserve it kind of letter. You know, where she was like, that kind of thing. And I didn't find it. I have to say, like, that surprised me, what I didn't find. She was very confident, and in her letters even, she says, you know, she criticizes her technique and wants to get better, but she is not saying, I can't do this, or I don't deserve this, even when she's exhausted. And it's interesting. I mean, in a way, I found it very off-putting at times. She felt very formidable, which is something her friends said also about her. But I was also surprised to see that her, in private, she was considered not a good comic actress. She didn't try it very often. But in rehearsals, her fellow actors said, like, she's hilarious. She's constantly cracking jokes. She's so fun to work with. She's really supportive of other actors. She made loans to other actors and artists. And in private too, I mean, her friends often wrote about what a wonderful sense of humor she had, and how she loved to entertain people at parties and give readings. And so she was like a consummate, she reminds me of like Anne Hathaway. She's a theater person and like wants to perform, you know, at all the time. So learning about her character and realizing that she was not me and I was not her, but I can, you know, it was really fun. It was really cool. And in terms of her memorial, no, I think as some people here might know, her lover and wife, I would say in all but law, Emma Stebbins, was the sculptor for the Bethesda Fountain. And she was the first woman to receive a public arts commission in New York. And she was Cushman's wife for about 30 years. And during the time she was sculpting that, Cushman was an inspiration for that sculpture. And when the reviews came out, they predictably said, oh, she's too masculine, her thighs are too big, et cetera, et cetera. She's too powerful, essentially. Which if you look at the Bethesda Fountain, just seems really crazy. But no, we're waiting. There should be some sort of public marker or memorial to Cushman, particularly in New York or Boston, where she did live most of her life.
Yeah. Well, this book is one large step in that direction. I'm sure of it. Earlier tonight, you talked about how Cushman kind of came of age at a time when the Transcendentalists were really big and thinking a lot about nature. And so this person writes that they love the passage in the book of Charlotte's love for climbing trees, and is asking if you can expand a bit on how that may have been so beneficial to her creativity.
Yeah, so she loved climbing trees. She liked to hide in trees. I got the feeling that her parents' marriage was not always happy one. They had a lot of money troubles, and her father eventually disappeared. So she, there's this image of her climbing trees where she could hide there and have a break. And also, if you look at early pictures of Boston, it's gorgeous. There's rolling fields and sheep and a lot of agriculture. And so from the top of a tree, she had this big vista, 360 vista. But she also loved to take long walks. And I think nature was really restorative for her. It was the only time she was ever alone. She was really well known for going everywhere with an entourage, like 10 people. She didn't like to be alone most of the time. I think she got depressed, in fact, when she was by herself for any length of time. But she did like to take solitary walks out in nature and to go up in Harlem, which was at that point still forest, and take walks.
Love it. Really does sound like my kind of person.
Yeah.
Here is a great question that is a bit more about Charlotte's approach to acting. How much information survives about how Charlotte approached certain roles and how those approaches might have differed from her contemporaries? Mm-hmm. And if you would like, could you also talk a little bit about her interactions with directors and cast members and, just how much creative control she had?
Right. Well, yeah, these questions really go together. There were no directors at the time, which I kept thinking, like, who directed this performance? No, I mean, there were certainly theater managers who had some control of who was cast, but a lot of the creative control fell to the stars. And, you know, for example, when Cushman was in London, even though she was an American, she was able to essentially force her castmates to use the full text of Shakespeare. They were really pissed because they hadn't memorized all those lines. So she had a lot of creative control, in fact, especially once she became more famous and was able to sort of say what role she wanted. So, I mean, in terms of the way she created her characters, I've talked a little bit about Romeo. I mean, her Lady Macbeth is really the contemporary Lady Macbeth we know today. And she, you know, created that. She came into a culture that idolized the British actress Sarah Siddons, who was very beautiful, very talented tragic actress, whose Lady Macbeth was a seductress and had, you know, she, of course, if she looks like Sarah Siddons, yes, that's a great way to play that. And Cushman took it in a totally different direction. One of her co-stars once said that, complained to a reporter that, like, oh, I think she's gonna hit me at some point, like he's afraid of her. And other actors sometimes didn't like that because they felt like it made them look weak, like Edwin Booth, for example, later on. So that's a big part of it. She, with her Hamlet, it was also took advantage of her intellectual bent and her close study of the text. And I one of the earliest scenes or moments that made me want to write this book was thinking of Cushman looking as she does, who, very buxom on stage playing Hamlet, saying, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt. And people have asked me if I feel like she was trans or would be now. And there's a moment in that scene that just really touches me that I don't know. I mean, she didn't have that option, at least not officially, and so, but there is definitely this moment of wanting to sort of shed her skin and shed herself, that's echoed in the text, which is really exciting to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like you found an incredible amount of research on Cushman. So I think that this is a very apropos question. Were there any biographical pieces or scenes that didn't make it into the book that you wished you'd had room for?
So many. I have a whole list. Yeah. I mean, yeah. There is, yes. There's a scene where when she first meets Elizabeth Barrett Browning, they're on a balcony and Napoleon III is staging a violent coup to retake France. That is when they met. So, like, that is an amazing scene. But, there are a lot of interactions with famous people who we know now, that had I shifted my attention to them fully in the book, I think it would have taken away from her story a little bit, but I think deserved kind of like their own story, their own scrutiny. So yes, there's many more, but she touched on everybody. I mean, she was a household name. Actually, there's a really great book that does do this, by Alexander Nemiroff, called Acting in the Night. And he writes a whole book about the performance that Cushman gave for Lincoln in DC, during the Civil War. And so there's a lot more to be written, in that case, an entire book. And he describes it as Wallace Stevens' anecdote of the jar, where there's a jar that's placed in nature and it absolutely transforms the nature around it. And so he's envisioning this performance by Cushman as doing that.
Sounds great. It sounds like there's almost another book in this about Cushman. And so, speaking of books about Cushman, I absolutely love this question from Carla. How do you imagine it might have affected you if you had been able to read your book in high school or college?
Yes. Yeah, that was a big reason why I wrote this. Yeah, so I always felt like there was something that wasn't being told to me when I studied history, and I had a wonderful history professor John Zola in high school, and he had us studying totally different history, not in the textbooks. I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is totally wrong. So, I mean, I think if I had read this book as a young woman, it would have been liberating. I think her eagerness and ambition and like unself-conscious, like, how would I put it? Like power, I think would have been really exciting. I think things are shifting, I hope, but I think I came of age at a time when you cannot be a powerful, and it still happens, come on, you cannot be a powerful woman without apologizing for yourself all the time. Or if you don't, guess what? You're called a Lady Macbeth. So, I think as a young woman growing up with this book, that would have shifted for me. And I'm hoping that this book does do that now for other people, of all genders who like have these ambitions and don't want to be small or make themselves small so that other people will like them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is a question that's kind of in a similar vein. If you, Tana, could go back in time and watch any performance of Cushman's, which would it be and why?
I wish. Yeah, I think I would sneak into the theater, sit near Lincoln, in that theater in DC, and watch him and watch her and that whole interaction, because this was the time when Lincoln was writing the Gettysburg Address, and he made her promise to play Lady Macbeth for him, and she does. And watching her, seeing her Lady Macbeth, but also seeing her like grief over this murder that happens in her dream state where she's trying to wring the blood from her hands. And Cushman did not, she wrung herself out, and it was very physical. And watching Lincoln, who was so, feeling the blood on his own hands at that time, would, I think, be really powerful.
Yeah, sounds like it. Sounds incredible. And just a side note, as someone who so admired your book, the way that you dramatize those scenes on your own pages, it really felt at times like I was watching the theater. So just beautifully, beautifully done. And a quick side note, alongside all of these questions that we're getting, we're also just having so many comments, just glowing comments about other people who loved the book and the connections that you're making between all these historical figures and places and time periods. So you already have a lot of fans out there. Let's see, here's a question, Tana, from one of your former students at Columbia, who says that their writing changed dramatically within a period of 3 or 4 months. And then says, you have been researching and writing about Charlotte for the last 10 years. How has your writing or writing process changed over those years? And is that reflected in your writing on Cushman?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my students. So yes, they were subjected to me talking about it. But yeah, I mean, I've been working on it for a long time. It's sort of become sort of integrated into everything. Yeah, I think my writing changed a lot. I've written a lot of shorter historical profiles, and I'm very interested in the power of the profile and the biography to charge history, with a narrative. And it's very exciting. The wonderful writer Brenda Wineapple says, like, we have to resist the sort of the tyranny of the biological narrative, which is just like birth to death, right? And then somewhere in that life find some sort of narrative that's more meaningful than that. So my understanding of the form really changed as I wrote a full-length book, for sure. And I realized that my subject was going to be really annoying sometimes and really resistant to me writing about her. I feel like it's no accident that as an actress, she might not want me writing about her sometimes, or certain things. But I also learned about a lot about the research process and translating, transforming research into narrative in a responsible way, and really that it's a lot more about collage work and piling up the details until you have enough for a scene, so that you're not making anything up, that this is all what's happened, but learning about, researching the 360 narrative of like, who's writing about her, who's writing about this performance, who, who has mentioned her in their own letters, and then what does she say about it? And then what's going on contextually, in the world. So that's changed a lot. I mean, in terms of my own writing, I think too, just being sensitive to detail and just trying to like care for the few sensory details that I could collect. Like those were really important. So, yeah.
Right. Well, there's another question here about your writing process, and that's that while you were writing a book about the past, that was deeply steeped in issues of power and privilege, how did you avoid circulating certain stereotypes, about race, class, sexuality, gender, etc.?
Well, I hope I did. I mean, it's in us. I mean, that's part of the problem, is even if we don't want it to be in us, we're infected. And I definitely tried to be aware of it. And I hope I did what I could in this book. But definitely being aware of even just like really cliched ways of writing about color, not even race, but just, in the 19th century and today, you just see like blackness is always badness. And it's just really insidious, and it's not something that you want to repeat. It's also important that I didn't want the 19th century voice to be the voice of this book. I wanted it to be my voice and a contemporary voice. And so, I do write about Cushman's partners, for example, as her wives, I suppose, because they fulfilled that role for her, even if they couldn't legally be married. So yeah, I mean, those are just a couple of examples, but I definitely tried to make sure that the book wasn't echoing and picking up on the stereotypes of the time and
Right.
of our time.
True, very true. Well, we have just a couple minutes. So I'm going to squeeze in one more question here, one last question. And that question is that it looks like Charlotte's look seemed to be very commented on. She didn't fit into the quote unquote mold of a star. So how do you think she was able to disregard the comments and continue being herself, continue being a strong, capable woman?
Yeah. A critic once wrote that Charlotte, her dearest wish was to be beautiful. But Charlotte never wrote that in any of her letters. I think if she had wished that, she would have said so to her sister, to her mother, to her lovers. She did not. So I don't agree. I don't believe that. I think that she really styled herself as a man in many ways. And I think those also were the characteristics that were admired in the 19th century. Quote unquote, feminine characteristics were disparaged at every turn. And so by embodying what was masculine, she embodied what was admirable. And I think that was one of the ways she navigated this. And she even told reporters, I am the head of the house. I am the man of the house. I support my family. This is for them. It's not for me. Although, of course, some of it was for her. So that was a part of the way that she managed that criticism, was actually by stepping into that role more rather than trying to apologize for it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Tana, thank you so much. This has been so wonderful. And again, I am so glad and grateful that this book now exists in the world. And I can't wait for other people to read it. So I have more people to talk to about this book.
Thank you. And hi, everybody out there. Thank you so much.
Tana and Amy, thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on the publication. And just to everyone out there, you can, most importantly, buy a copy of the book from communitybookstore.net. We have plenty in stock, and we are happy to ship them in this bizarre time. And otherwise, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Amy and Tana, for your time. And otherwise, everybody stay safe, be well, try out that cocktail. I drank this cocktail. It was quite good.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night, all.